with us on this fine Thursday evening. For those of you who joined us last week when we talked about dead wood, by golly, we're going to talk about dead wood again today. Last week it was from the wildlife perspective, and today we're going to talk about it from the tree and forest perspective. It's nice to see so many people on this evening, and looks like I'm looking at the chat and folks are coming from all over. That's fantastic. So I'm going to jump right in here and start with talking about processes within the tree, because if we're going to talk about forest health and how trees are affected by different agents, we need to do a quick review of what goes on inside a tree, and then we can see how different agents disrupt those types of things. So tree health is going to be compromised when key processes within the tree are disrupted. So if we think of a tree, here we have a picture of a tree. It's got a crown, the roots, and the stem. And the crown, of course, that's the factory of the tree. Nature's solar panels, photosynthesis going on, making sugars for food. The roots anchor the tree and take up water with dissolved nutrients. And then the stem elevates the crown above other vegetation, so it's got a competitive advantage for sunlight. And then that stem also has to be a big plumbing system. Water and nutrients have to go up from the roots to the leaves, and sugars produced by the leaves have to go back down to feed the roots. So let's look at the cross section of a woody stem here. So I have these different concentric circles here representing the different layers of a woody stem. And there's the two big circles in the middle there. We have the orange one in the middle, that's heartwood. And then the yellow ring around that is the sapwood. So heartwood is just older sapwood that has filled in with minerals and so forth, and it turns a darker color, and that's just part of the storage and structure of the tree. Sapwood is for water transport, sap. Now, when you get that sticky stuff on your hands, you're like, oh man, I got sap on my hands. That's not sap, that's pitch, and that's part of a tree's defense chemicals, which we'll come back to later when we talk about insects. But sap is basically just water. It might have some dissolved nutrients. It might have some dissolved sugars in it. So water has to be conducted up through that sapwood tissue all the way up the tree to the top of the crown. Now, how does that happen? Well, unlike us in the animal kingdom, we have hearts pumping fluid through our vascular systems. Trees don't have that. So instead, they rely on physics, and specifically the physical properties of water. So if you think about water molecules, they have a polarity to them, a positive and negative charge on opposite ends there. And so that means that they attract to one another, which we call cohesion. So you think of like a spherical drop that, how water coheses together there. And it'll attract to other things, which you call adhesion. So you think of a water droplet stuck to a window or something like that. And so if we go up to the leaves are covered in these tiny microscopic pores called stomata. And that's where gas exchange happens for photosynthesis, or a process that we call transpiration. And that's where the pores open up to take in carbon dioxide to turn into sugars. And they release a little bit of oxygen, and they release a little bit of water vapor. So that water molecule that's right next to that pore, when it opens up, it evaporates out. But because of cohesion, it pulls the one next to it to the front of the line, which pulls the one next to it, which pulls the one next to it. And it's pulling on this continuous chain of water molecules that goes down through the sapwood all the way to the roots, where new water comes in through osmosis. So you've got these continuous chains of water molecules, and together as they go up the stem, we call that the water column. And we call that model of water transport transpiration pull, because that transpiring, that release of water vapor out those pores in the leaves, is literally pulling water up the tree. And within that heartwood and sapwood, of course, you find the annual rings that you could count to see how old the tree is. And then outside of that center portion, we have that green ring. between the woody part, the xylem, the sapwood and heartwood, and the bark, which is both the inner and outer bark, and this is the cambium. And this is where new growth comes from. So putting on that new annual ring, new sapwood every year, that's coming from the cambium. And then outside that, we have the bark. And the inner bark, which is that dark circle, is we call phloem. And that's the plumbing line going the other direction. So sugars produced by the leaves are translocated down through that phloem tissue to feed the other parts of the tree. And this is why if you take a strip of bark off all the way around the tree, the reason that kills the tree, or what we call girdling, is because it severs that phloem pathway, and then the roots starve and the tree dies. And then the outer bark, of course, is there for protection. Okay, so that's a quick look at the tree level. Let's talk about the stand level. Now, what is a stand? Well, a stand is a unit, if you will, of the forest. So it's simply a contiguous area of similar vegetation. So when we talk about a forest, we're usually going to refer to a forest stand. So many trees make up a stand, and then you can have different types of stands, like maybe you have a conifer stand or hardwood stand and a mature stand, a young stand. Many different stands will then make up the landscape. At the stand level, let's do another brief review here about looking at how forest stands develop, because this is going to be important when we look at how trees get into trouble and kind of when in the life cycle, and what are the management implications of some of the forest health things that we're going to talk about. So at the stand level, forest development cycle is driven by disturbance. So some sort of major disturbance, what we call stand replacing disturbance. And if we look at the natural history of Western Washington, just like that top picture there of a forest fire, fire was our major disturbance agent. You could also have windstorms, or down at the bottom, we see that photo of Mount St. Helens, very big stand replacing disturbance. And there in the middle, we see a stand that has been harvested, so a human disturbance. So disturbance happens, and we tend to have a negative connotation with disturbance. And when we think about things like fires, that's understandable. When wildfires come into the edges of our communities and the human environment, and we see loss of life, we see loss of homes and businesses and so forth, some major loss and disruption. Out in the wilderness, though, out in nature, disturbance simply is. Nature doesn't have that value system that we bring when we think about what's good or what bad. In nature, stuff simply is, and there are things adapted to it. So if we didn't have these major disturbances that we have this negative association with, we would lose entire suites of plant and animal species that rely on disturbed areas or edges between disturbed and undisturbed areas. So disturbance happens, and the reason I want to pause here to talk about how whether something is good or bad is not inherent in nature, but something that we bring to the picture, is because this is important for understanding forest health. Stuff happens, trees die, diseases, and so forth. Whether it's good or bad is going to come down to your lens, your filter of your objectives. What is it that you want to see? Disturbance happens, and then we might go through some basic stages of forest stand development. So we're going to start at the beginning. We see in the upper left photo there a very young stand of seedlings. This stand was planted. You can also have naturally regenerated seeds, where seeds just blow in and germinate naturally. So stand initiation, the overstory's gone, so there's lots of growing space, and not just the physical space for trees to occupy, but also the conceptual space of resource availability, primarily light, water, and nutrients. The fourth key ingredients for tree growth is carbon dioxide, but I think we can probably all agree that is not going to be a limiting factor. Now, when trees are young like this, it's okay to have a bunch of them close together, but then as they get bigger and they start to expand a little bit, then things get crowded. So the branches will overlap, they'll shade out everything below. And we have what we call canopy closure. And then that moves us into the second stage. So the photo on the upper right there, where we have very dark, dense conditions. So because of that canopy closure, now everything below is shaded out. We can see in this image that the understory is basically gone, and it's dark, and there's a lot of just young, skinny trees in there. Now, over time, with different natural processes at work, that dense structure may break up, and you may see trees dying off because of they're losing the competition battle, or different processes can cause openings, gaps to open up, and then we get into gap dynamics. And as if that breaks apart, then we get into the third stage we see in the lower left there, and notice that this is a much lighter forest. There's sunlight reaching the forest floor, and because of that we see a lot of understory in that photo there. We've got a brush layer, several different layers of understory there, so we call that understory reinitiation. And then if those natural processes persist in the absence of disturbance, which is always the caveat, then we might get to the old growth stage. And we can see that in the lower right photo there, characterized by big trees, and the big trees are pretty well spaced. And there are also little trees. There's multiple canopy layers. There's some dead trees. There's a big dead log there in the front. So this is a very complex environment. So keep this in the back of your mind, and we'll kind of come back to some of these principles and see how they relate to forest health. Big important principle: tree health is different than forest health. A healthy forest has sick, dying, and dead trees. Now, why would a healthy forest include dead trees? Well, because of wildlife. 40% of our vertebrate wildlife species depend on dead trees, whether standing dead trees, which we call snags, or down logs on the forest floor, what we call coarse woody debris. So really important wildlife connection here. And so I want to start thinking of forest health in terms of a systems approach. Instead of thinking at the individual tree level, let's look at the system. And within that system, tree mortality is not necessarily a bad thing. It provides critical wildlife habitat. So again, good or bad depends on your objectives. If your objective is wildlife, hey, a few dead trees might be a really good thing. Even things like disease, whether or not it's good or bad, is within the context of your objectives. Typically, again, we would have a very negative connotation with disease, especially with coronavirus right now. But in the forest, we have certain just native pathogens. So think root disease, which we'll talk about a little more later. And here we have those two photos again of stem exclusion and understory reinitiation. That dark, dense stage to that much more robust, complex stage with better habitat and so forth. Hey, a gap, root disease pocket, a great way to create a gap to start breaking that structure up and actually moving things forward in development stages. So, things like disease could have an ecological role. Now, if your forest is the two trees in your front yard, they have root disease and they're leaning towards your house, that might be a big conflict with your objectives. So we always then come back to that. And I should note here that I'm talking about our native pests and pathogens. And these are organisms that co-evolved with our trees, such that trees have developed some natural resistances to them, and that keeps the system in balance. Where we really get into trouble is when you get an introduction of a pest from overseas that our trees have no experience with. They don't have thousands of years of building up resistances to, and you can see entire species get wiped out or nearly wiped out. Think American chestnut with the chestnut blight, American elm with Dutch elm disease, our own western white pine with the white pine blister rust, and hey, the emerald ash borer, that's on the insect side of things, coming our way. What will that mean for our Oregon ash? Nothing good. So if we're going to think about forest health, we should also keep that in the back of our minds too, that that might be the biggest threat of all. So when it comes down to dead trees in the forest on the landscape, it is kind of a question of balance. Having a dead tree component for wildlife, great. If they're all dead, like there we see in the photo on the right, all those trees are fire charred and dead, and maybe that's not going to meet our objective a little more than we need for wildlife, and we're a little short on the live trees there. But then on the left, we have a couple of dead trees mixed in with some live trees, and that might be okay, just depending on your objectives and where that balance falls. And also trajectory. So that's when I think about trajectory, you think about a rocket and where it's headed. I think of trajectory in terms of forest development. So given the site and the current conditions, how is that stand going to likely continue to develop? And is it going to develop into something that's going to be overcrowded, stagnant, unhealthy? Or is it going to grow into whatever our desired future condition is, whether it's to let it grow towards old forest, old growth conditions, or to grow towards a harvestable product, and so forth. So when we assess a stand and look at the objectives, say, okay, is this stand on track to meet our objectives or not? And if not, we might need to do a course correction through some sort of management intervention. Okay, so in terms of managing for a healthy forest, it really comes down to managing stress. Just like with us, when we are stressed, our immune systems get compromised and we become, it's the same way with trees. So here we have a simple chart, and there on the x-axis, we see tree density expressed as trees per acre, going from fewer to more. And then on the x-axis at the bottom, we see tree diameter going from smaller to larger. And then I have this curved red line that's out in this chart. And that represents what's possible. The area under that curve are size density relationships that are biologically possible. Beyond that red line, you're beyond the carrying capacity of that site. So there's only room for so many, and you can have fewer trees that are doing really well, or you can have a whole bunch of trees that are all starving to death together. And if we think back again to this idea of trajectory, you can probably see my mouse here. We start out here at the left, and high up, we have many small trees. And the growth trajectory is going to be to the right there as those trees get bigger and bigger before they start running into problems. And as trees get bigger, they need more resources, which is why the bigger the trees get, the fewer there need to be in order for the trees there to have adequate resources. So if that red line is what's biologically possible, the limit of what's biologically possible, you'll see inside of that, I have another red curve there that's a dashed line. And this is what we would call the zone of imminent competition mortality. That's where things are getting so competitive that something's got to give. If the stand is to keep growing and trees are going to keep getting bigger, some of them have to go at this point. Density's got to drop. And if you think about like a true old growth forest that you might see in places like the Olympic Peninsula or Mount Rainier, and you think about how far apart the huge trees that the remnant of the initial cohort are, they're dozens of feet apart. So over time, something happened to get that stand from a whole bunch of really small trees to far fewer really big trees. And we would call that self-thinning. So as the trajectory, growth trajectory, it hits that zone of imminent competition mortality, trees start to die. Some trees, for various reasons, might have growth advantages over others. The ones that are at a disadvantage, they get overtopped and shaded out, and they're going to tend to drop out of the system. Whereas the trees that have advantages and are bigger and stronger, they will then grow into those spaces and commandeer more resources. And that may happen kind of in fits and starts over time. Now, we talk a lot about thinning as a mechanism to deal with forest health issues. Now, why, if stands have been self-thinning for millennia, do we have to do any sort of manual thinning? Well, there's a few reasons, two key reasons. One is that with modern forestry, things tend to be really uniform. So if you think like after a natural disturbance, and there's still they're going to be a bunch of dead trees, down logs, a very messy site with lots of different microsites, and you'll have seeds coming in from all over, different species, wide genetic range, and so forth, random spatial arrangement, a few years difference in germination time as trees get established before the canopy closure. And it's all this variability that allows sort of winners and losers to sift out of that. But now we like very clean sites, get all the debris, pile up and burn it, and then we come in with our, uh, you know, all our seedlings, usually all one species, Douglas fir, and we come out and we plant them on exact 10 by 10 spacing, and they all came out of the same breeding program, so very similar genetics and so forth. And it's hard to get that survival of the fittest to happen when they're all equally fit. And that's what it comes down to. We like our trees so much, we want all of them to survive, but then we run into problems. So it's going to be more difficult for the stand to sort itself out naturally in terms of self-thinning because of that uniformity. And at the same time, we have piled on additional stress of climate change, development pressures, fragmentation, introduced exotic pests and pathogens, competing invasive vegetation, and so forth. We end up kind of with what I like to call nature trying to survive in an unnatural world. And so we combine the extra stress on top of just that normal stressful competitive part of the life cycle of the stand with a longer period within that stressful zone because of uniformity, and things can get pretty hairy. So we want to stay out of that zone between the dashed line and the solid line. That's where you have trees dying, lots of competition-based mortality, and lots of stress. We can't immediately fix some of those other stress issues, but we can control density. What happens when trees get stressed? Well, they have to prioritize. Not enough resources to go around, so how is it going to prioritize its resources? Number one priority is always just to maintain its living tissue, stay alive. Then you have fine root and leaf production, as this is what's going to be able to garner more resources of sunlight, water, and nutrients. Reproduction. And this is a relatively high priority because that is biological success for an organism. Then you see height, branch, and root growth. These are where you can put more fine roots and leaves. And finally, we get down at the bottom, the lowest priorities, the luxury items, diameter growth and resistance to insects and diseases. And these are the first two things to go because they don't help the tree in the competition battle for resources. Trees can still grow in height in an effort to get above their neighbors and win the race for sunlight. But diameter growth, it's just like us. When we take in more resources than we need, we grow in diameter, right? Well, trees are the same way. And at the same time, losing that resistance to insects and diseases. So stressed trees are now highly vulnerable to pests and pathogens that may otherwise not have been an issue. Now, when it comes down to the big question of why are we seeing so many dead conifers right now, and not just conifers, but tonight I'm going to focus on conifers, is it comes down to this. Climate change is increasing the stress in our forests, especially water stress. If we look back at the last 10 years, the last decade, many of those summers we hit records for drought and heat. And that adds up in terms of the toll it takes on our trees that may not be well suited and well adapted to these extreme summers that we've been having. You can have direct impacts. Oh, middle of summer, tree runs out of water and it dies. Indirect impacts where tree becomes under stress because of heat and drought, and then because of that, it gives up its immune functions and becomes vulnerable to secondary attacks from things like bark beetles and so forth. That's the indirect impact. Cumulative impacts, and I think this has a lot to do with what we're seeing right now, is we're not talking about just one bad summer. We're talking about year after year of trees just getting hammered. And there comes a limit at which trees sort of give up. And finally, delayed impacts. And what I mean by that is we may not see right away the impact of the stress on the tree until later. So think back 2 years ago to spring 2018. And that's where people really started to notice all the dead cedar trees all over the place, big ones, small ones, and so forth. Well, what happened in spring 2018? Well, our thinking is probably nothing. But rather, remember the summer of 2017 was one of the absolute worst in terms of heat and drought. So by the end of that summer, the cedars, which have very low drought tolerance, had given up. But then we had a very sudden shift to the wet season in September, and we ended up with a record wet fall, winter, and spring. So like a Christmas tree in a stand of water, those trees stayed green through the wet season. And then just as soon as we warmed up and dried out in the spring, they all turned brown together, just revealing damage that had actually taken place months earlier. But let's talk about what happens when trees are under drought stress. So think back to our model of the tree stem and that sapwood, where water needs to flow up, be pulled up the tree through transpiration pull. Hot, dry day. Stomata open up because the tree wants to eat. And on that hot, dry day, water molecules readily evaporate out. And so they're putting a lot of pull, a lot of tension on that water column. But if we're at the point where the soil moisture is depleted, so there's no new slack coming in the other end, at some point that the water column, those chains of molecules are going to get tighter and tighter until the chains break. And we call this a cavitation. And now there's an embolism, an air bubble. And it's an embolism in the vascular system is just as lethal to trees as it is to us. Because now you have a hydraulic disconnect. In order for this to work, water molecules have to be touching. And so you've got an air gap in between. You think you're pulling something up on a rope, someone cuts the rope, and just all you get is the cut end of the rope. So take a look at that photo on the left where we see a tree that is green halfway up and then it's dead. The whole top half is dead. Well, right where it turns from green to dead, that's where the water column failed. And now water could no longer get past that point in the top of that tree. Everything above it died. So this is why drought stress is typically expressed as top down. It's showing where the water column broke, where it couldn't get water all the way to the top anymore. Or as we see on the other photo there, especially with young trees like these two young cedars, the tree just may outright die entirely. Cedars have really low drought tolerance, and so do hemlocks. So here we see a photo of a hemlock that's losing all of its foliage, but it's happening from the bottom up, not the top down. What's going on there? That's not what we would expect under drought circumstances. It was thought for a while that there was a fungal disease. It's a web blight called Rhizoctonia that was taking advantage of drought-stressed hemlocks and killing off the needles, and that's what was causing this. And it's looking now like that's not actually the case. I haven't found any evidence of this fungal pathogen in hemlocks that are experiencing this. Nothing's shown up at the lab, and I know pathologists at DNR are also questioning this as well. So we're back to the drawing board on that. I think there's broad consensus that it is drought related. We're just not sure what the mechanism is. And it could be that maybe the tree's taking a different strategy where it says, okay, my uppermost foliage gets the most sun, so it's most productive. To save water, I'm going to get rid of all my lower foliage and just focus my limited resources on my most productive older foliage. That's possible, but again, we don't know for sure. We're just pretty confident that it is a response of some sort to the extreme drought conditions that we've been having. So that's the abiotic side of things, environmental stresses. And it's not just drought, you can have winter injury, air pollution, some other stuff like that, flooding. On the biotic side of things, so things caused by organisms, root disease is the big player in Western Washington. It's a little different east of the mountains, where insects are a bigger deal east of the mountains. West of the mountains, though, it really comes down to the root diseases. And here in that photo on the lower right there, we see an example of our most common root disease, which is called laminated root rot, which causes the wood to delaminate along the annual rings. And you can see there that the wood is just coming apart in sheets along the annual rings. So we often joke that it should have been called delaminated root rot, but laminated root rot, it remains. And then above that, we see a picture of a stump that's turned up. Like, you think of a tree that goes down and it works the whole stump out of the ground, like, like in a windstorm, if it doesn't snap off, you get the whole tree, including that giant root wad coming up, and that's just mechanical failure, soil failure, really. But when it looks like this, where you have a stump turned up and there's no big root wad attached to it, you got just little mushy stubs where the major roots used to be attached, that's an indicator that that is due to root disease. So what does a root disease area look like? Well, check out the photo on the left here, and we have lots of trees that have gone down. So this photo is in an opening, a gap in the forest. There used to be trees there, but we can see they're all on the ground now, and they're falling all different directions, just a crisscross pattern there. Had it been a major windstorm with just mechanical failure, trees reach their breaking point, they would all be going the same direction. But that random tree fall pattern, that indicates that it's root disease. And here's another photo there on the right. We see a tree that's gone down and it doesn't have a root wad attached to it. It just has these broken kind of mushy stubs where the major roots used to be attached. And you can see that it's even kind of hollowed out going up the tree as some of that disease moved into the base of the tree, some of that decay. Now, oftentimes around this opening with all the down trees, you might see this. So the photo on the left there, we've got a couple of dead trees or snags. So these are trees that died from the disease, but just haven't fallen yet. And then on the right, we see trees that don't look so good. Notice that they've got thinning foliage and yellowing crowns there. And the thing to notice about this is it's a uniform fade. So the crown is all thinning at once. It's not a top-down or bottom-up type of pattern. It's uniform. And yellowing, we call that chlorosis. You can also see in both the sick-looking trees and the snags that the tops look a little bit rounded. And its trees are struggling to take up water and nutrients because their roots are rotting away. In addition to diameter growth, well, the next thing to give up is height growth. And so things are really limited. That height growth increment is going to get shorter and shorter every year and create that domed appearance. Sometimes I see that. I don't always, though, but I do look for it. And then you might see these beauties here. So here we see a couple of fresh snags, and they've got cones all over them. And these are called stress cones. And it goes back to this relatively high priority of reproduction. So the tree thinks, okay, this is the end, so I'm going to make one last hurrah for reproduction before I go. Now, what's the difference between stress cones and just a good cone year? Typically, with stress cones, you're going to see other symptoms, like the trees being dead in this picture. Pretty good indication that those are stress cones. But if the tree's looking sickly, it's thinning out and so forth, and you see those cones, like, okay, that's probably stress cones. The other thing is, notice how these cones, they're small. They don't really look very good, not like normal, healthy cones. If instead you have a really healthy looking tree that's got lots of really big, fat, plump cones throughout it, that's just a good cone year, which is cyclical. What happens in root disease areas? Well, root disease, this isn't something that's spreading through the air. Rather, it spreads underground in the soil. And it's not the soil itself, but rather it's spreading through the decayed root material of previously infected trees. So here we have a diagram of a horizontal profile of a root disease pocket. So again, because it's happening under the soil, it's a localized phenomenon. And we have an open in the middle there with just stumps, and the roots attached to those are colored red. So we have some trees that have red roots and some that have black. The red represents infected roots with a root disease. And then outside of that, we see some snags. If we're moving to the right there, and then that next to the last tree on the right, we see it's got some yellow in it, so it's not looking so good. Starting to have that thinning crown and chlorosis, and then the one next to that looks pretty okay so far. So as tree root systems expand, they come in contact with one another, and they even graft together, and that's what spreads the disease from an infected tree to an uninfected tree. And we also see in this diagram, there's some little seedlings in the middle. Maybe someone came back and tried to plant seedlings to replace those that had gone. Well, if they plant species that are susceptible to the root disease, notice how as those little seedlings, as their root systems expand, some of them start to turn red, and then they die before they even make it to a few years old. What do you do about root disease? You could go and dig up all the stumps or do pushover logging to get all that material out of the ground. But what I tell people is if you got a root disease pocket, hey, that's nature's way of telling you to grow some more cedar. Bring some diversity. Why cedar? Well, cedar is resistant to most root diseases. So if we think about laminated root rot, Douglas fir and grand fir are the most susceptible. And then you might have the hemlocks and the spruces be moderately susceptible. Pines are tolerant, and then cedars are resistant, and then broadleaf species are actually immune to that particular root disease. So what we would recommend instead is going in air like this, go out to the last tree showing symptoms, so that next to the last one on the right there, and then go maybe 2 trees beyond that, assuming that those might be in the early stages of infection, just not showing symptoms yet, and take out all the host species within that perimeter. So it's laminated root rot. You want to get all the Douglas fir out of there. If there are cedar seedlings in there, by golly, leave those, and then you can come back and you can plant more to start to fill that in with resistant species. Or you could come in with maple, which would be immune to laminated root rot. And in nature, this is what you see happen, is these gaps start to fill in naturally with vine maple and western red cedar, which are shade tolerant and disease tolerant species. So that's kind of the best approach. Think about it as like excising a cancerous tumor. You want to get a clean margin around that root disease pocket. Let's talk briefly about insects. Now, the insects tend to get the most attention because they get all the press. And you've probably heard in the news over the past decade of the bark beetle outbreaks and all the dead forests in eastern Washington and British Columbia, Colorado, throughout the inland west. And those are predominantly pine stands that have been attacked and killed by mountain pine beetle. On the west side, our bark beetles are generally opportunistic and typically associated with other ailments. So they're taking advantage of a tree that's being beaten up by something else. So back to our little diagram of a tree stem, now we're at that dark brown ring, the inner bark, the phloem tissue, that sugar-rich phloem tissue. And that's what those bark beetles are after. So they want to get under the outer bark. And then as you see in the photo here, you see a beetle, and they're about the size of a grain of rice, has kind of tunneled out a little area here, and then she'll lay her eggs on either side of that, and they'll hatch into larvae, which will start spreading out their little tunnels off to the side as they munch through that yummy phloem tissue, and creating the pattern that we call beetle galleries. And every type of bark beetle has its own unique gallery pattern, and that's what they're after. But trees can defend themselves from bark beetles. And this comes back to the tree's defense chemicals, the pitch, the sticky stuff. So there on the photo on the left, you see a Douglas fir tree, and it's got these white streams down it of dried pitch. So under the bark, there's a network of pitch ducts, and that pitch is kept under pressure. And so when you get a bark beetle that starts to drill through that outer bark to get at the phloem, it ruptures one of those, and that pressurized pitch encapsulates it, kills it, and pushes it back out of the tree, what we call pitching out. Now, if instead of those pitch streamers, you see what we see on the right, which is little pockets of red sawdust we call frass in the crevices of the bark, well, that means that that tree was not able to successfully defend itself. And just because you see pitch dripping down a tree does not mean it has bark beetles. More often than not, that's associated with little cracks or types of physical injuries as opposed to bark beetles. So how does all this stuff work together? Well, here's a quick case study. I go into a property where they had a bunch of trees die. First thing I notice is in that photo on the left there, we see the standing dead trees have these white blobs on them. Those are fungal conchs from a stem decay called pouch fungus. And then I knock some bark off, and on the inside of that bark where the phloem is, we see there's a beetle gallery in there. We actually see a couple of larvae squirming around there. So that tree has bark beetles. And then that photo on the right, we noticed there that it's an opening that's got snags around it and then sick trees around that. Classic root disease pattern. So what happened here? A raging laminated root rot infection killed a bunch of trees, which attracted bark beetles, which bring in on them spores for decay fungi like pouch fungus. So it wasn't a pouch fungus or beetle problem. The trees would be just as dead without those. Rather, these are secondary opportunistic agents. What bark beetles really like, and I'll use a Douglas fir beetle as the example here because it's our most destructive bark beetle in Western Washington, is a freshly dead tree or a tree that's almost dead from something else. Why? Because that phloem will stay fresh for a year. And so if you think of beetles emerging in the spring, and if there's a tree that came down in a storm or a tree that just died from root disease, it's got fresh phloem and no defenses. And that's the ideal situation for the bark beetles. So yeah, insects get all the press. And you've probably never turned on the news and seen a feature on laminated root rot. But insects are what we tend to be more aware of, what we hear about more. We know they spread quickly, so it induces a lot of panic. And yeah, if you find a dead tree and you knock off the bark, by golly, there's bark beetles under there. And there is a correlation. It's just the opposite of what I think most people conclude. It's not the bark beetles that killed the tree. It's the tree dying that attracted the bark beetles. And we really need to get this right so we don't start doing crazy stuff that can be damaging to our property or to the ecosystem. Here in these trees, especially the cedar on the left there, we see that its innermost foliage has turned bright orange. And this, you see this every September, right around mid-September. And are these trees dying? No. That's just its oldest foliage, 6-7-year-old foliage that is not productive anymore. So the tree discards that. Just like the deciduous trees, it turns color and falls off. It's just old foliage, not current year's foliage. And all the conifers are doing that. You see it The yellow needles in the pines there in the picture on the right, it's just more obvious in pines and cedars. You don't see the interior needles dying as readily in, say, Doug fir or hemlock. So that's just seasonal housekeeping. Sometimes folks mistake this for bark beetle damage. So here we see a tree and it's got these kind of 1/8 to 1/4 inch holes and they're all in rows. Now, bark beetle holes are like pinholes and they're just random around the tree. When you see these larger holes and you see them in rows, that's not a bug. By golly, that's a bird. So here we have a photo of the culprit here, the red-breasted sapsucker. So what happens when we panic and don't get the diagnosis right? Well, your forest may end up being just a charred pile like we see on the left, or covered in herbicide like we see the person spraying here, or pesticide that is, like we see the person spraying here in the photo on the right. So one time I got a call from someone who was absolutely convinced that every cedar tree in the area was dying, and that this whole community was going to lose all its cedar trees if we didn't do something to stem the tide of this insect. Uh, well, folks, it ended up being one tree, first of all, and that tree was in someone's yard with lawn all the way up to the tree. And they'd been watering out there, so it couldn't be water stress, right? Wrong. Because sprinklers are great for watering lawns and really horrible for watering trees. It doesn't penetrate through that thatch layer to get down to the tree's root zone. So lawn and trees don't mix. The grass robs the water from the trees, and the trees cast shade over the grass. So there's always that tension there. So instead of needing to go around spraying poison all over the community to save all the trees, this was just one tree suffering from poor cultural practices. And then in the other situation, someone was convinced that uh, because there were trees of all different species dying on his property, that he needed to come in there and cut everything down and burn it all right away. And nothing I could say could convince him otherwise. He is just determined that this is what he needed to do. And so you think about the expense and the damage to the property that resulted from that. Okay, well, we're about done here, so let's wrap things up. Identifying and dealing with problems. Multiple species, large area impacted, that's your abiotic stress, like drought and heat and so forth. It's across a lot of different species because insects and diseases, those are host specific. They only go after certain trees. Root disease has been the most common Western Washington biotic agent. That's the big player. Insects can be a problem. We do have insect outbreaks that kill trees on the west side. It just shouldn't be your first assumption. That said, with climate change, with more and more water stress, I think we're going to see a much greater presence of these types of insects going forward. What can we do? Well, what we can't do is a quick fix. Products aren't the answer. You can't go to, it's not like a rose bush where you go to the big box store and you find something you spray it with and black spots go away. It just doesn't work like that with the forest. Instead, we need to make long-term changes to the trajectory of that forest and think in terms of the system and not the individual trees. So if we see in a stand that maybe the cedars are dying from water stress, well, okay, then let's replace those as they die with something more drought tolerant. And that comes down to the second point here, which is right tree, right site. The tree tolerances have to be well matched to the site. And yes, with climate change, that becomes a moving target on some sites. But really think of drought tolerance and take your cues from nature. If your cedars and your hemlocks are fine, hey, don't worry about it. But if you see species dying, say, okay, if I'm going to replace those, I need to go up a notch in drought tolerance. Density management, we talked about that a lot earlier. The cup of water is getting smaller, and the more straws that are in there, the thirstier everybody's going to be. Just say no to grass, we talked about that. There's resilience and diversity. And again, this is another long-term system type change where over time, take opportunities to introduce other native species into your forest to diversify your portfolio. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Because again, insects and diseases are host specific, and also different species have different tolerances to wet and drought and so forth. So you can hedge your bets by introducing more diversity in there. And finally, we probably need to learn to tolerate. And this means getting away from that knee-jerk reaction of, I need to do something. And that's where I see people get into trouble is just that feeling of, I can't just let these trees die, I need to do something. And that's where this needless poison spraying or burning and all sorts of crazy stuff happens. And we need to take a breath and say, okay, trees have died, we have some wildlife habitat, and let's kind of look under the hood and say, okay, what's going on in this system? And what are some long-term changes to trajectory I can make to make this system more resilient going forward? Final messages: tree mortality, not necessarily a bad thing. Remember that wildlife connection. How many trees, where they are, what your objectives are. Well, that's what drives whether something we would consider something good or bad. Nature is complex and very messy, and that mess includes dead trees. And it's going to get messier with climate change and more dead trees. But maybe we can look at dead trees a little bit differently, especially if you're with last week's session on the importance of dead trees for wildlife, and see some of the beauty in the mess, see some of the beauty in the chaos, because in that mess is function. So maybe we can recalibrate our idea of what's beautiful in nature. And finally, I think one of the most important adaptations we need to make for forest and climate change is that of our expectations. Expectations lead to disappointments, which lead to crazy stuff like spraying and burning and things that will take us the wrong direction in terms of building more forest resiliency. Okay, I have made it to the end. We've blasted through that. Let's take some questions. I see Brendan has been busily typing away, answering questions in the chat box. Thank you, Brendan.
Yep, absolutely. And one more reminder in case anyone missed it at the beginning, if you need your teacher clock hours or your SAF credits, please send me an email. But let's move on to questions.
Okay,
So,
I'm ready. And if you need to jump offline now, feel free to do so. We are recording this. We are capturing the Q&A as well, so you can always come back and watch that later on if you want.
okay. So as part of another question, Brandy was asking about big leaf maple die-off. Did you
Okay,
cover that? I may have been zoning out with the tech support email.
I did not. I focused on the conifers
Okay.
tonight. Big leaf maples, yeah, we're seeing trees dying off because of that. Parts of trees or whole trees, and it's not like a wholesale die-off where you just look at all the maples. They tend to be scattered individuals, but it's everywhere to the point of being noticeable. And sometimes maybe the tree didn't die, but it start doing some weird stuff like putting out leaves that are really, really tiny instead of those giant leaves that you think of with the aptly named big leaf maple, or the leaves are yellow around the edges, almost look singed. What's going on here? Uh, we're not totally sure. It's been studied for any type of pest or pathogen, and there's nothing that would tie any of this together. The UW finished a study on this recently where they found no correlation with any sort of organism, biotic agent, but rather they found a correlation between increased temperatures and proximity to development. So in other words, we're not sure what's going on, but we're pretty sure it's our fault.
I would add, though, that they also did look at a lot of the major pollutants and didn't find any correlation with those either.
Yeah, so probably
including ozone and things.
And probably road salts as well.
Yeah, exactly. Lena asked, Kevin, our objective here is to protect our high-value trees in the vicinity of our cabin in Northeast Washington from a bark beetle infestation. So Eastern Washington, a bark beetle infestation on our neighbor's acreage. What is the most effective way to keep our trees beetle-free?
What kind of trees are they? So if you can clarify that in the chat
Lena,
box.
can you
and then I'll come back to that once you've had a chance to enter that. So I'll take another question. I'll come back to that.
Okay. I answered that one. Frank, also the sickest spruce. I'm not quite sure what you were referring to with the aphid. With the expected problems of drought stress, what do you think of increasing the practice of chipping all waste when doing any extractions to create an even depth chip layer which preserves soil moisture and adds organic matter to the forest litter? This was common practice in stand thinning, harvest, and site prep in the UK on contracts I worked on.
Okay, well, I'm a big fan of chipping in general because of the reasons you said. It's soil building, nice big mulch layer and so forth, and fire risk is nil. It becomes a question of balance again, though. If you get rid of all the down wood and the dead wood, you're going to lose your wildlife habitat. So if wildlife is important to you, chipping everything is probably not what you want to do. And dead wood, it's not contagious in that sense. So if a tree falls over from, say, root disease, that down tree on the forest floor is not perpetuating that disease. So it's okay to keep that stuff. And the big stuff is also not a fire hazard. That stuff doesn't carry a forest fire, it just chars. It's the fine fuels that carry the forest fire. Another thing you can do is you can take some down material and consolidate it in a pile, like a habitat pile. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when Ken Bevis talks about habitat enhancements. And so back to this idea of balance, maybe you want to chip some and leave some. Nothing wrong with that.
All right. Patrick asks, what animal strips bark from 3 to 5 foot tall seedlings?
Seedlings.
I'm going to say deer rubbing their antlers is the most common thing in smaller
Yeah,
trees like that.
I agree. And next week, we're going to talk about animal damage control, where we'll talk about deer browsing, deer rubbing, other things like bears and porcupines that and voles that can get after your trees. But yeah, I agree. That sounds like deer rub to me.
Porcupine will usually target larger trees, but they will leave strips. And mountain beavers will tend to eat just the whole small little branch or sapling or seedling and not just eat the bark. Loretta asked about the recording. Yes, we will be sending out this recording to everyone who registered, whether or not you were here tonight. Jason, probably dear to Patrick. Yes, that's what we agreed with. Some thank yous. Thank you all as well. Joan, yes, last week's talk is recorded and available. Go ahead and email me and let me know exactly which talk you want, and I will send it to you. Leah asks, we have a lot of conifers dying and alders replacing them. Almost no conifers coming up. Should we plant? Do we leave it and let it take its course? 2.5 acre area.
Well, you probably know what's coming, which is that it depends on your objectives. There is nothing inherently wrong with letting it go to an alder stand. That may not be what you want, though. If you want more long-term, alders are very short-lived, and then that in turn can yield to just a brush patch. If you want long-term conifer cover, yeah, you could go ahead and plant. Make sure there's enough sunlight, and I would use shade-tolerant species, unless you wanted to go out there and actually make a clearing. Harvest all the trees, open up an area, and then you could come in and you could plant shade intolerant species like Douglas fir if you wanted to quickly get conifer saplings up and going there. But if there's enough sunlight to match the shade tolerance of what you want to plant, and you work at keeping competing brush away from your seedlings, and no reason why that can't work.
All right. Terry just had a comment. She said, you have made me appreciate our old growth forest on our property behind us. We have lots of undergrowth, dead trees, animals, etc. Habitat for everyone. That's
Excellent.
fantastic. Jason asks, thoughts on incense cedar? How about the moving the giants and start planting California redwoods?
This is a question that comes out up a lot, and it's something that we would call assisted migration, with the idea being that yes, climate has changed dramatically back and forth over the eons, but never this at this speed, and so species don't have the response time to shift their ranges. Should we doing assisted migration? A lot of people are talking about it. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to that. I think the better question is, if we do assisted migration, what do we bring? And people tend to gravitate towards trees they like rather than trees that may be well suited here. And trees that they like that grow south of us, because it gets warmer souther, so these are trees that are used to a warmer climate and may be a good match for the temperature-wise our climate over the next century. The issue here, though, is that more than temperature, it's the difference in precipitation patterns that's the real kicker. So, for instance, redwoods, temperature-wise, Puget Sound area looks great, in 20 years for redwoods, but redwoods are not drought tolerant, and they need that cool summer fog that you get on the Northern California coast. So, it's going to be just as unhappy here as our native drought tolerant species. Things like sequoia, those are a little bit more versatile and a little more drought tolerant. That could work. I don't know enough about incense cedar and its tolerances, um, but consider the site and the rationale, and really think through, okay, what are my objectives, and what's going to meet those objectives. What I would tend to encourage is to continue using our native species, which I still think are going to be the best adapted to this area, just be going up in drought tolerance. So if things aren't cutting it for the hemlocks and cedars, shift to Doug fir and grand fir. If things aren't cutting it for the Doug fir and grand fir, then you can go up to the pines, and uh, even into things like oak and madrone. I think a really reasonable assisted migration is bringing more ponderosa pine into the Puget Sound area. Now, typically we think of this as an east side species, but there are native west side populations of ponderosa pine, namely in the Willamette Valley in Oregon and in the South Puget Trough, the prairie lands down there, where you'll see traditionally, before development and fire exclusion and so forth, you'd have these mixed stands of ponderosa pine and Oregon white oak. So to bring those a little bit further north, especially into dry places like the San Juan Islands and so forth, we're talking a short distance, and I think it's a very reasonable choice. So look at pines. If it's a shade, if it's a sunny spot, you can use like lodgepole pine or short pine. And ponderosa pine is also, I think, a really good option if you really have a tough site drought-wise. And that's going to be driven by soil. If you have that really gravelly glacial outwash soil where water drains super quick, and it just doesn't retain the moisture, those are going to be the more challenging sites where you're really going to have to look at drought tolerance.
I'd also add that a lot of people are looking at moving seed zones up. So instead of bringing species from the south, they're looking at species that we have here, but have different populations with different moisture and environmental tolerances. So instead of planting with Douglas fir from, say, Whidbey Island, you now get seedling stock from farther south, say in Oregon, and plant it up on Whidbey Island. And you can go to and look up seed zone maps and find seed zones that match future climate projections.
Ultimately, though, this is uncharted territory.
Yeah, we're just starting to see some early results of some research in those areas.
Yeah, but still very, very, very early. Okay, what's next?
Dave asks, what are the best field guides to ID pest and root rots? So my favorite is one I'm about to link the name of in chat here, or it is the Forest Service Field Guide to the Common Diseases and Insect Pests of Oregon and Washington Conifers. It is out of print, but you can find the PDF for free online in a few places. And used copies are available, but they're very expensive. Do you have some other favorites, Kevin?
That one's my number one, and my second one would be Common Tree Diseases of British Columbia.
Yeah, that's a good one
which
too.
is a nice book put together, of course, by our friends to the north. And that you can also get as a PDF online. I heard rumors that they were going to start to print that first one, the Forest Service Field Guide, but
Oh, really?
unsubstantiated as far as I know.
Yeah, and I haven't found a good sort of concise guide to hardwood diseases. The most of them are focused on the conifer diseases in the Northwest here.
Oh, maybe we need to make one.
Yeah. Uh, Lena. Oh, so Lena, who asked earlier about the beetles on her property and how to prevent damage,
Uh-huh.
she's elaborated that grand fir seem to be the most susceptible.
Okay, so grand fir, I'm going to guess it's fir engraver beetle. It could be several things. And you might want to connect with the DNR forest health person for Eastern Washington. Her name is Melissa Fisher. She's way more knowledgeable than I am for more specifics on that. But same general principles apply, is maintain tree vigor and really good spacing. And if the grand fir are particularly vulnerable, you might want to be favoring maybe some larger Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine. But the key is going to be keep them vigorous, which comes down to really, really good spacing. And the natural spacing for a lot of Eastern Washington is really wide open savanna type structures. And that the reason that we have such a dense forest now in Eastern Washington is an artificial result coming from fire exclusion. But you can do some restoration work there. So that's what I can offer you in terms of advice on that.
All right. Kathy asks, I'm starting to see a gray-white fungus on the 28-inch DBH Western red cedar in my yard in Olympia. The tree looks pretty healthy, but there's one dead branch high up and some resin weeping. I understand what you said about tolerance, but I love this tree. How can I tell if this tree is in the beginning stage of decline, and is there anything to do? Any advice?
So can you tell me more about this gray white thing you're seeing? Can you describe that a little more for us? Where is it?
Now, you might send us an email with some pictures, but long term with a cedar, it may be fine. I mean, part of the reason why when you go out into an old growth forest and you see those massive cedars that you can walk inside of there because they're completely hollowed out is because they're so uh, rot resistant that they can actually persist with those rot pockets in them. Whereas if any other species got a rot pocket like that, it would kill it instantly. Whereas the cedars can actually live quite long, happy lives with a good part of it very, very slowly rotting out. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's condemned. I would worry about it if it's near your house. So that's definitely a concern, and you might have an arborist come and pay it a visit.
But yeah, I think the first thing is don't panic. And as Brendan said, cedars are really resilient in the face of injury. And I'd be interested more in this fungus that you're seeing, and if you could describe that more for us, that could help us. And oftentimes the thing to do is take a wait and see approach. But if, again, as Brendan said, safety comes first. If you have reason to believe that that tree might be compromised and it could pose a safety threat to your home, then you probably want to get a consulting arborist to come out and take a look at that. So you want to find an arborist who's ISA certified, and I would recommend you do a consultant only, just because with the commercial arborists who actually do the work, there's an inherent conflict of interest where they stand to gain if you decide to take the tree out, whereas a consultant is just purely in an advisory capacity, and the consultants will often really specialize in hazard tree assessment. And Brendan, if you get a chance, would you please put into the chat box a link to the PNW ISA Certified Arborist Directory?
Yes. Is there a good way to, is there a definitive way to recognize root rot without digging up the tree to look at the roots?
It depends on which type of rot it is. There are a lot of different ones. If to really get a positive ID, if you haven't had trees that have already gone down, or you can investigate the rotting roots, you do have to do some excavation.
Yeah.
I think if you see that pattern of tree decline kind of emanating outward, and you see evidence that trees have fallen there in the past, that's a good indication that it's a root disease area, and you might just work under that assumption.
And also just even thinning of the entire tree's crown.
Yes.
So it's not thinning from the bottom up or the top down, but the whole thing is becoming a little chlorotic or yellow and thinning out all at once.
And it might start to get that dome top appearance as well. So those are signs you can look for, or symptoms, I should say, that you can look for. But if you can excavate around the roots and maybe get some, see some actual signs of the fungus itself, and take some samples and get an ID on those, that's ideal. And this is another thing that a good consulting arborist might be able to do, is do a little bit of careful digging to do some identification.
Simon asks, if drought stress is expected to be a problem in young Douglas fir stand that is ready for PCT, would it be better to thin it less than, say, D+8 to try and avoid soil temps increasing and try and conserve soil moisture through more shade?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Brendan, what do you think?
I would say in general, you're going to see way more benefit in terms of soil moisture by removing that competition in those other trees. Now, you should always be concerned about thinning shock in general. So it's really hard to say without seeing the stand. But I would say you're going to see much larger benefits from thinning harder rather than less. And I mean, that soil is going to dry out. That top layer, because below, what is it, 30 or 50 centimeters, the soil temperature doesn't change throughout the year here in the Northwest. So that soil temperature is only affecting the moisture levels at that very top layer, which isn't necessarily the layer you care about that much, because it's going to dry out in the heat of the summer no matter what. So I don't think you're actually going to be saving that much moisture by reducing forest floor temperatures. Then you'll also allow more dew in, most likely, into the lower part, which can help foliar absorption. I would say my instinct would be heavily on the side of thin more.
Yeah, and everything in moderation. So maybe rather than really hitting it so hard that you're way opening things up, maybe you do a more moderate thinning and then do a second thinning 5 years later.
Right. And that's to combat the thinning stress, which is definitely a separate concern.
And can also mitigate wind damage as well.
Yeah. All right. MK Gannon asks, 50-year-old cedars dying one every year, all top down. Seems like a root disease except for a jump to a remote tree. Any ideas on stopping this?
This is classic drought damage. Classic symptoms of drought. Cedar is resistant to most all of the root diseases that affect our other conifers, but they're highly susceptible to drought. And with root disease, you see that uniform fade. With drought, you see top down. So that's a water stress issue. And maintaining vigor, if they're dense, thin them out so there's less competition. And if they're just not cutting it, then you might look at replacing those with something more drought tolerant going forward.
All right. If you have a dead top dead Douglas fir, but the bottom looks healthy with new growth this spring, can you save the bottom by removing the dead top, or is it toast?
But the dead top's not going to make a difference one way or another. And that tree may persist for many years with that dead top. In fact, these are great wildlife trees because you have a live tree below and then the snag on top. You get a twofer out of the deal. That dead top, there is going to be a decay vector from that that's going to start to infect uh, the stem of the tree, but that's going to happen whether you leave it or cut it off. So I think the bigger issue is safety. That point where it goes from green to brown, that's going to be a weak point, a break point. And if that thing can get broken out and tossed through the roof of your house, yeah, you might want to think about alleviating that issue.
If it's not near your house, because that losing that top's a huge concern, cutting the top off is going to create a flat spot where a rot column almost immediately starts on the top of the tree. It's one of the reasons why you never want to top a tree, because you're going to create a rot column that goes down the middle of that trunk. So I would say leaving it on there would probably increase the longevity of the tree and slow that rot column down, but it will eventually form. You might try, it'd be an interesting question for some arborists that have done a lot of work in this area. If you did a slanted cut at the top that didn't allow water to build up, that might help. What do you think, Kevin?
Once again, what was that, Brendan?
Oh, doing a slanted cut on the top, because if you just do a flat top cut on a live tree like that, you're going to be starting a rot column where the water starts pooling and eating out the middle of that trunk there.
Yeah, they do those slanted cuts, or sometimes slant on both sides, make it like a
Right.
peak, like a roof, so that water
I
drains
don't know how
off.
big of a difference it actually makes, though. I've never seen any actual research on that.
When they want to make wildlife trees, when they want it to get a soft center for the cavity nesters, they
Right.
they might they will make an actual divot or make it more
Right. Then they
ragged
slash
so
it up and
that
make it
water
look
will
like a.
collect there. Yeah, yeah. All right, what's next?
Second question. What about weeping Alaskan cedars? As a landscaper, we have noticed the last couple of years they are healthy at our nursery, but repeatedly die when we plant them in the landscape. I don't know what a weeping Alaskan cedar is. You mean just an Alaskan yellow cedar?
They're Alaska yellow cedars that are kind of bred for small landscape
Oh, okay.
environments. A very, very typical kind of yard tree.
They're a horticultural
Yeah.
variety.
So,
Okay.
and as that kind of falls out of my purview in terms of forestry, and might need more of a horticultural expert to look at that. Lots of different variables, site variables, you know,
Yeah.
transplant shock, water stress are the obvious ones. It also depends on where you are. I had a couple cases from Central Washington this spring, including one that was dying Alaskan yellow cedars, where the some of the damage was consistent actually with winter injury.
Mm,
So lots of different variables. It's I guess it's just too general to where I can speak
yeah.
about that intelligently.
You might give the master gardeners a try on that one. How do you prevent brown butt rot in grand fir trees? Also see Indian paint fungus on these affected fir trees.
Uh, so I'm not sure which rot you mean by brown butt rot.
There's
Uh,
quite a few brown cubicle butt rots.
yeah, but when you're talking about stem decay, like Indian paint fungus, typically these are things that get introduced through injuries. If something breaches the bark, that's going to be the vector for decay. So preventing trees from getting rubbed by something or hit by something and so forth, uh, I think that's the best strategy for keeping away the stem decay fungi.
All right. Peggy asks, tops of cedars around my house are dying or dead. Will the bottoms be okay as long as they have enough water? Are the tops likely to break off in a windstorm? I should say, could the bottoms be okay as long as they have enough water?
The tops may break off in a windstorm. So, if that could pose a threat to life or property, you might want to consider that. But cedars, because of their decay resistance, are really resilient in the face of injury. And you can see in old growth forests where a cedar has had the top blown out in a storm, and so the next highest remaining branches turn up to form, say, two new tops, and then those get blown out by a storm. And so two highest branches on each of those, now you got four tops, and you'll end up with these cedars with this giant candelabra of a top to it. And that's not unusual, and actually a really cool structure for wildlife. The underlying issue, though, sounds like it could be water stress. And so, yeah, everything above where the water column broke there is dead, and you could take it or leave it. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference to the tree. It just might be a hazard mitigation thing. But if that drought conditions persist, you might see the water column break again further down. And so, now you've got a shorter and shorter green section. So that's something to watch. If you see continued decline, you might think about replacing that with a more drought tolerant alternative.
Simon comments, says, yes, Kevin, some very good ponderosa pine growing on joint-based Lewis McCord in dry conditions. Yep, that's the exact population Kevin was talking about.
Yep.
That's my comment about the field guide. Indian paint fungus is an excellent natural fiber dye, by the way, off topic. All right. Kathy, it's on the trunk at the base and it's new. Where can I send the pictures? You're welcome to email me. I'll type in my email here and I'll see if I can figure out what it is. And just remind me in the email what it is you're seeing and the problem. Oops, that's my Gmail account. You can email me at that.
All right, where are we here?
Where were we?
I've got one here.
Okay.
What needs to be done to the root rot area before planting another tree? As long as you're planting a non-host species, not necessarily anything. You don't need to sanitize or things like that. So if it's laminated root rot and you've taken out all the Douglas fir and maybe taken out the hemlock as well, it's okay to just come right in there and plant cedars or pines or maples, and that should be fine. If you were dead set on bringing Douglas fir back to, say, a laminated root rot site, then you'd have to do the scorched earth approach of digging out all the stumps and getting as much of that root material out of the ground as possible before replanting. But I think a better approach is just to plant a non-host species, and the disease won't bother that, so it doesn't matter if there's remaining decaying material there.
Lee asks, I have a 90-foot tall cedar with 4 major trunks. It looks healthy. Should I be concerned about so many trunks? Now, Lee, are those trunks separating above ground or sort of as ground, at the ground? Are they just twinned or quadrupled? Or is it separating because the top broke out and is forming that same candelabra formation that Kevin talked about?
If it's at the base, if there's 4 main stems coming up from the base of the tree, I suppose it's possible they were separate seedlings that grew together. Also, maybe deer browse when the seedling was about that high, and then you ended up with 4 tops.
Yes, or
coming up from that.
Or often what you'll see with the cedar is it gets knocked down flat on the ground, survives, and then those lateral branches grow up into new trunks.
So to sum that up, I think the answer is not necessarily be concerned if there's nothing wrong with it. And again, cedar is very injury resistant and decay resistant. But that said, I wouldn't try to thin those trunks if they're all connected, because you still are possibly getting a decay vector in there. So whenever you have those forked trees, it's kind of either take them both or leave them both.
Okay, so, oh, wait, I just lost my place. Some of the cedars are surrounded by English ivy, which has been invading the forest. Can this be removed and result in saving the tree?
Yes, and I would highly encourage that. So English ivy is a bit of a scourge, nasty invasive species, and it will start to climb the trees in search of sunlight. And so I'm sure you've all seen these trees that are just covered in ivy. Ivy needs ground contact. So it's not where you see, they almost look like little root-like structures where the ivy vines attached to the tree, but it's literally just glue. It's gluing itself to the tree just for structural platform. It's not taking any nutrients from the tree. It has to have a vine that travels back and has ground connection. So what you can do is maybe, around shoulder height, go around and start severing all those ivy stems. And you got to make sure you get them all. And you don't have to then peel them off all the way up this tree, which can be damaging to the bark because everything above that is going to die and it will turn brown and lose its leaves. That can take a while though, because of those thick waxy leaves. You may do it and it's like almost a year later, like nothing happened. So either you missed one or it's just taking a really long time to dry out, and it does take a really long time to dry out. And then that kind of stops the bleeding in terms of tree damage, and then you can work on uh, getting as much as you can off the lowest part of the tree and around the ground, and maybe starting to pull that up from the ground
Yeah.
and chipping away at that.
Every once in a while, you'll see ivy put roots into a rot pocket up in a tree if that rot pocket has a little bit of soil in there. And so people will think that it's parasitizing the tree, but it's actually just growing in that soil. Like Kevin said, it's not a parasite. It's not pulling any nutrients directly out of the tree.
That said, it will still physically strangle the tree
Oh, yes.
or put so much weight on it that it pulls the tree down. So that's the
Yeah.
danger to the
Oh,
tree.
yeah. No, it will kill the tree. Sorry, I didn't mean to try and minimize the danger.
It's just not through parasitic means, but
Right.
through actual physical. Uh,
Uh, let's see. We've got Mary asks or says she's interested in trees which remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Pick
How?
anyone you want.
Yeah. Well, I would. So she asks, how does alder, cedar, and fir compare in capability per acre?
Oh, I would say that, well, alders grow really fast, but they're not long lived. Doug fir grows almost as fast as the alder, so it gets big quickly and can be fairly long lived. Cedar doesn't grow as fast, but it can get really big and be long lived. When it comes down to it, in terms of trying to maximize carbon sequestration, I think choosing between species is kind of splitting hairs. And so I tell people that you just pick one you like. It's going to do the job. It's going to sequester carbon. And just, yeah, keep trees, plant trees, but don't necessarily worry about what species it is, or trying to optimize. And it also has to do with the site, because you could have a tree that on a great site puts on a lot of growth, a lot of carbon, but maybe on your site, it'll really flounder and not grow well. So I would pick a tree that you like and that's really well adapted to your site.
And remember, when we're talking about CO2's and carbon sequestration in plants and forests, the only carbon that you're sequestering is what actually gets put into that biomass of the tree. So on throughout a daily cycle, the tree is photosynthesizing during the day, taking in CO2, putting off oxygen. At night, it's respirating, and it's burning those sugars and producing CO2 again. So throughout that daily cycle, you're only actually sequestering a very small amount of carbon, and that's what's actually being put into that woody structure of the tree. So when you're talking about sequestration, you're purely talking about volume growth of wood in that tree. So if you were truly trying to maximize your carbon sequestration, you'd be moving to more of a timber plantation model where you're trying to produce as much wood as possible, remove that wood when that volume growth starts to decline as the trees get bigger, turn it into some sort of product that sequesters the carbon, let's say shaker furniture that people are going to keep for hundreds of years, and then planting new trees that can grow super quickly and continue to absorb carbon as quickly as possible. So I don't think most people here probably actually aren't that interested in perfectly optimizing their CO2 sequestration. So like Kevin said, there's still sequestration in any good healthy forest, and I wouldn't stress too much about trying to sort of min max perfectly optimize it.
You probably don't want to pick a tree that's inherently small. Like I
Right,
wouldn't go for, say, a dogwood or a cascara
right.
or a shore pine.
Or like you said, alder that's going to in 60 years fall over, decompose, and go back up to the atmosphere.
Yeah, but any of our large, long-lived conifers should be fine. The most important thing is to make sure it's the right tree for the site.
All right, I think that resolves all of our questions. You're welcome, Steve. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for spending the evening with us. We certainly enjoyed having you. And we want to wish you all a very pleasant rest of your evening and a very pleasant Friday into what's hopefully will be a wonderful weekend for you.
All right, have a good one.